that's my link between the end of Götterdämmerung and Parsifal.
And I just wanted to make one little comment on this, and then we can open the floor to questions. We'll see. And what Peter is talking about is exactly correct, and that is the idea that in Parsifal we have a universal love, not a kind of selfish, or even if it's unselfish, it's still romantic love directed at one person. And what I said back on Thursday was that when we look at the operas through the ring, that after reading Schopenhauer, Wagner's idea was not any longer redemption through love, but rather redemption through renunciation, which in the context of everything through the ring was correct. Now, when we go to Parsifal, we have something that's a little different, because now we're talking about not romantic love anymore, or not love that's just directed toward one person, but as Peter said, love that's now universal. Now we can go back to redemption through love. And it's no longer redemption through renunciation by itself. It's now redemption through this universal love. Redeemed, if you will, from the old karma and all of the machinations that we saw in the ring. And now in Parsifal, all of that is actually understood and cleansed. And we have final enlightenment.
Well, we're at a Jesuit university. Let me see if I could look at it from another angle. When I lived in Germany for 5 years, I went to Parsifal at very special times. At Easter, the Germans called it the Easter Opera. We took it very seriously. Americans in the crowd who didn't know the rules at the end of the opera, who applauded, were literally struck. In a German house at the end of Parsifal, there is no applause. It's considered a deeply moving Christian experience in the sense of a message coming through another channel, the Judeo-Christian channel of a universal love, an attempt to go outside oneself to find others, to incorporate their suffering, to share. So we are aware, of course, that Wagner is Wagner, and that people have used and abused him through the ages, particularly in a terrible period in the 20th century. But just holding that thought for a moment still, why Peter and Paul, the names of two rather prominent...
Who both died in Rome, by the way.
Why do the Germans call it the Easter Opera?
Well, the story, of course, is based on the medieval myth, and so the features of the legend of Parsifal are rooted in the Christian tradition, Christian Europe, following the Crusades and bringing back Eastern ideas, and you find this reflected in Parsifal. The Knights of the Grail are on the Gothic side of the mountains of northern Spain. Klingsor and his castle are on the Muslim side, the Moorish side of the mountains of Gothic Spain. So these are all reflections of the post-Crusade period. The imagery is certainly very Christian. And although Christ is not mentioned, the Redeemer is frequently referred to, and the Last Supper is referred to. A very beautiful scene takes place on Good Friday. Wagner had no trouble in combining this imagery with ideas and images drawn from Buddhist teachings and Buddhist legends. And apart from the swan, there are numerous others. The Mara, the temptation of Parsifal, of Klingsor's flower maidens, parallels the temptation of the Buddhist demon Mara and his daughters, and so on. Lots of other stories. Wagner had no trouble combining these at all, because what he was looking for was an imagery of compassion. And he found this not only in the Buddhist stories, but also in the Christian Gospels. And so Good Friday is important, centrally important, because this is a manifestation of compassion. This was the death of Jesus out of compassion for all humanity. It's another powerful image of compassion. And so throughout, Parsifal brings all of these traditions together because they involve that central message of compassion and the wisdom that comes out of it. So you can have a Christian aspect, you can have a Buddhist, you can have a universal aspect of it, but it all comes back to the central idea of wisdom, redemption through compassion.
Well, I'd like to just expand on that, because Peter's completely correct in what he just said. I think part of it also depends on who knows what the Buddhist stories were. And as I mentioned before, which is what Peter also just said, that Wagner is going beyond the outward forms of religion to the essential universal truths that can be expressed through these symbols. And very briefly, one thing that Peter mentioned was the temptation of Mara. What he's referring to is the Buddha's enlightenment. And when the Buddha was very close to his enlightenment, he sat down beneath the Bodhi tree, which is the tree of enlightenment, and he vowed not to rise until he had attained full enlightenment. And in the course of the meditation of that evening, Mara, who is the tempter in Buddhism, came to him to try to keep him from his enlightenment. And he brought out his daughters, young girls, and that didn't work. He brought out matrons, that didn't work. He actually brought out older cronies, that didn't work. So then Mara said to the Buddha, "Who are you to be doing this?" And the Buddha simply touched the ground in front of him with his right hand, which you'll see depicted in many, many Buddhist paintings, saying, "The earth is my witness that this is to be." And then when that temptation didn't work, Mara brought out his whole army. And the army is depicted in Buddhist art as devils and demons and monsters and ogres attacking the Buddha with spears, with arrows, with swords, everything. And what's happening is that the Buddha is sitting on his lotus throne. And that is his seat of meditation, and he's not moving from the meditation. He's recognizing that everything that's arising around him that's being depicted in this fashion is nothing other than projections of his own mind, his own desires, his own illusions, etc. And he understands that these are not real in and of themselves. And because they have no substantial reality, he does not resist them. Because he doesn't resist them, they have no power over him. And all of the weapons that are hurled at him turn into flowers and fall at his feet, which is exactly what Wagner says at the end, for his stage directions at the end of Act 2. When the castle falls, nothing is left except withered flowers on the ground. Now, if you know all of this, you can see the Buddhist aspect of Parsifal. If you don't, you'll see the Christian aspect. And like Peter said, it's okay. Both of them are okay. And as far as the Buddhism concerned, and this is really the answer to your question, Patrick, people will see in Parsifal what they know themselves and what communicates to them. And like Peter said, it's okay. Either one is okay.
High tech.
You can use mine if you want.
Can you hear me in the back of the room? Yes. Is it not true that in writing Das Ring, he got through two, labored hard and put them down, and took a very long break, and wrote instead a very long opera, Tristan. And then he came back to Das Ring. When he came back to Das Ring, was he more Buddhist then? And therefore are the last two operas really the working out of this new thought? And do we only find it by forcing ourselves back? Or do you think it's even there in the very beginnings, in Das Rheingold? Paul? Peter?
Certainly when he broke off after the second act of Siegfried to write Tristan, and then Meistersinger, he did so for a whole variety of reasons, but amongst them was this growing awareness that there was another dimension to his work that he hadn't thought about logically before. And therefore, this is reflected in Tristan, which is, I mentioned the influences of the Upanishads and Buddhist influences, certainly. And by the time he came back to the Ring, to the third act of Siegfried, which is a world away musically from what had gone before, he was now empowered. He was now empowered because he realized that in the past he was moving in this direction subconsciously, and that's why he said, I now understand for the first time my Wotan. Up until that point there was a conflict between his head and his heart, as it were, the conscious mind and the unconscious. Now they were brought together, and so he was infinitely stronger when he set out to write the third act of Siegfried and Götterdämmerung. And quite apart from his tremendous technical skill, which one finds at that point, I think in terms of his creative powers, this was an important step forward. It had begun before, but he hadn't realized what it meant.
And I just want to first of all say Peter's completely correct. And let me...
How come you never say that about me?
Because you left out Meistersinger. So this is what Wagner wrote to August Werkel in 1856. Wagner had now read Schopenhauer, and poor Werkel was in prison because he was in the revolution in 1848 with Wagner. Werkel got caught and Wagner didn't. That's why Werkel was in prison and Wagner was out of prison. But Wagner writes to Werkel, and these are wonderful letters if you have a chance to read them. I was scarcely aware that in the working out, nay, in the first elaboration of my scheme, I was being unconsciously guided by a wholly different, infinitely more profound intuition, the consequence of which was that as I was true to my living intuitions and not to my abstract ideas in my completed work, something quite different saw the light from what I had originally intended. And this, Peter, this is largely what you were talking about, is that by the time Wagner comes back in 1869 to the third act of Siegfried, bam, all of this is just moving forward in a much more understandable way right now for Wagner himself. But this little quote shows how much Wagner was aware himself that there was the conscious and the unconscious, and that both are working in him simultaneously. And this is one of the things that gives the great depth to all of his operas, particularly the later ones that we're talking about now.
You're absolutely correct.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you mentioned 1848. I thought nobody would. 1848 was a revolutionary age, starting in Paris, pressing on to München, Dresden, pushing on to Vienna. Europe erupted in a cry for freedom, political freedom, losing its shackles, moving into modernity. It's a very important time because it was crushed. Revolutions of 1848 were crushed by the aristocratic military powers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in Prussia, and in Russia. Wagner threw his energies into the 1848 revolution in Dresden and therefore had to flee for his life, listed as a terrorist. Those revolutions today are often used in your press to point out a phenomenon known as the Arab Spring. Will the Arab Spring end up being another version of 1848? And we hope not, I'm sure. But the political side of Wagner and his hopes for individual freedoms always seems to me very important, but that's because I'm a political historian. I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I have been so happy to sit up front with two people who are always absolutely correct. They've come from far away to be with us twice in this most wonderful, wonderful American ring. I was sure that I was going to hate this ring with a passion. I am a great traditionalist. I want Brunhilde with a winged helmet, not in a parachute. But I must say that I sat through all four, and I absolutely fell in love with the American ring. Now I'm waiting for the Buddhist ring. I already have the set. I was recently in Dongwang, which is in Central Asia, and it's a magnificent series of caves with the most magnificent Buddhist statues and carvings. It's out on the Silk Road. You should go there, crawl there, find your way there, and find your own enlightenment out in the Taklamakan deserts of Western China. And I want to tell you that I hope you will come back to many more events here at the Center for the Pacific Rim, a center that was built by a lady sitting in the front row here, Dr. Barbara Bundy. And also sitting next to her is a man who built the chair that I now hold here, the university, the Kiriyama chair. Peter and Barbara are great supporters of our center. Our center is a great supporter of the San Francisco Opera. If you want to see a piece of great opera, this fall, the opera is bringing us Turandot. So right in this very room, you will meet a cruel Chinese princess who's very good at cutting off people's heads until she meets the love of her life, and he gets to sing one of Puccini's greatest arias, and then the opera ends. Of course, it ended before it actually ended, and that Puccini died without finishing it, but it's now finished, and we will finish it here for you this fall. So please do come back to us. I now want to tell you that we never at the center ever sit for this long. We usually only sit for an hour, and then we go to your right out into the foyer and have wine and cheese, where our two speakers will join you and answer all of your personal questions about the ring. Please join me in thanking them for coming here tonight.